What kind of organization promises a champion the chance to build something historic, and then, before the mortar has even dried on the foundation, starts selling the bricks? That question does not have a comfortable answer, and the Toronto Maple Leafs front office, whether it's prepared to confront this reality publicly or not, has spent this week providing the most damning possible response through its actions rather than its words. Oliver Ekman-Larsson has been benched, frozen, and placed in the organizational window display, like a piece of furniture being cleared out before the landlord arrives. A Stanley Cup champion, the team's most productive defenseman, a player who arrived at Scotiabank Arena this summer, carrying genuine belief that Toronto was ready to compete at the highest level, and who has now been told, without ambiguity, that the organization that recruited him was selling a product that never actually existed. Oliver Ekman-Larsson, Toronto Maple Leafs, 2026. This is not a personnel decision. This is an institutional character test. And Toronto has failed it completely. To understand the full weight of what has happened here, you need to reconstruct the context surrounding Ekman-Larsson's arrival. This is not a player who signed with Toronto out of desperation, out of a lack of options, or because the financial offer was so overwhelming that competitive considerations became secondary. Ekman-Larsson came to this franchise as a Stanley Cup champion, a player who had just experienced professional hockey at its absolute peak, who understood what a genuine contender looks and feels like on the inside, and who made a deliberate choice to bring that championship experience to a market desperate for exactly what he represented. He came because the pitch was convincing. The pitch was that Toronto was done being a beautiful disaster, done constructing rosters that collapsed under playoff pressure, done cycling to the same failed approach while expecting different results. The pitch was that this time was different. 35 points into his Toronto tenure, with his defensive contributions providing the kind of experienced, composed blue line presence his roster has needed for years, Ekman-Larsson sits in the stands. Not because he has declined, not because his game has deteriorated below usefulness, but because the organization that made him those promises has now decided that his value is better realized as trade currency than as a contributor to the project he was specifically recruited to help complete. Stanley Cup champion player traded mid-season NHL. The tactical damage of this decision extends far beyond the immediate roster implications. Consider what Ekman-Larsson's 35 points actually represent in the context of this Toronto blue line. He has been the most offensively productive defenseman on a team that has struggled for sustained periods to generate consistent offensive production from its back end. His experience, the kind that can only be accumulated through genuine championship competition, has provided a stabilizing presence in defensive zone situations that younger, less proven blue liners on this roster have historically struggled to navigate under pressure. He is not a complementary piece. He is a structural component. And Toronto is pulling that component out of the architecture during the most critical competitive stretch of the season, not because the structure no longer needs it, but because the organization has decided that short-term asset accumulation takes priority over competitive integrity. That prioritization reveals something deeply troubling about the decision-making philosophy driving this franchise. There's a version of asset management that makes genuine strategic sense, identifying players whose market value exceeds their value to the current roster configuration, executing trades that improve the team's overall competitive positioning, and making difficult calls with clear-eyed analysis of the long-term consequences. What Toronto is doing with Ekman-Larsson does not resemble that version. What Toronto is doing is liquidating one of its most credible competitive assets, because the franchise's financial and roster construction decisions have created a crisis that now requires sacrificing genuine quality to generate the appearance of managerial activity. NHL Blue Line Defensive Production Statistics 2026. The ethical dimension of this situation is one that professional sports culture tends to minimize, but deserves direct examination. When an organization recruits a player, particularly a player of Ekman-Larsson's stature and competitive pedigree, there's an implicit contract that extends beyond the formal agreement signed on paper. That implicit contract involves organizational honesty about the competitive environment the player is entering, about the commitment level of the front office to the project being sold, and about the respect the player will receive as a professional if circumstances change. Toronto violated every dimension of that implicit contract this week. They recruited a champion under the banner of competitive ambition, demonstrated through their in-season management that the ambition was largely cosmetic, and are now treating the player they misled as a disposable asset in a salvage operation. NHL player trust franchise loyalty culture. The locker room consequences of this dynamic cannot be overstated. Every player currently inside that dressing room is watching how Ekman-Larsson is being handled. They are processing what it means that a Stanley Cup champion, a 35-point defenseman, a player who fulfilled every professional obligation the organization asked of him, can be benched and prepared for trade in the middle of the season without meaningful accountability for the decisions that created the conditions requiring such a move. The message being absorbed, whether the front office intends to send it or not, is that individual performance provides no genuine protection against organizational dysfunction. That no matter how well you play, no matter how much you contribute, no matter what championship credentials you carry through the door, the franchise's administrative failures will eventually find their way to your doorstep. That message corrodes competitive culture. It does not corrode immediately, and it does not always manifest in statistically obvious ways. But it accumulates in the fabric of how players communicate in the locker room, how much trust they extend to coaches and management during difficult moments, and how genuinely they believe in a collective mission when playoff pressure begins compressing every decision and every relationship inside the organization. Championships are not won by rosters. They are won by cohesive competitive units operating with genuine trust between players, coaching staff, and front office. Toronto has spent this week actively dismantling the foundation of that trust, and the consequences will extend well beyond whatever assets the Ekman-Larsson trade eventually returns. NHL playoff locker room culture trust dynamics. There is a historical parallel worth examining with uncomfortable honesty. Across NHL history, the franchises that have most consistently undermined their own competitive potential are not the ones that lack talent. They are the ones that developed institutional cultures of short-termism. Organizations where the pressure to demonstrate activity at the trade deadline consistently overrode the discipline required to build something genuinely sustainable. Those organizations became known in league circles as places where players arrive with ambition and leave with disillusionment, where the gap between a franchise's public narrative and its internal reality is wide enough to swallow careers whole. Toronto has been dancing on the edge of that reputation for years. The handling of Ekman-Larsson represents a significant step across the line. NHL franchise culture short-termism historical examples. Brad Treliving's mandate when he arrived in Toronto was to represent a departure from the organizational patterns that had defined and limited the franchise's ceiling for over a decade. The early signals were encouraging enough to generate genuine optimism among a fan base, with every reason to be skeptical. But the decisions accumulating around this trade deadline, the freezing of McMann's seductive efficiency, the reported pursuit of Robert Thomas through roster liquidation, and now the benching in preparation for sale of the franchise's most experienced and productive defenseman, collectively paint a portrait of a front office that has reverted to the same panic-driven, short-horizon decision-making that produced all the previous disappointments. The saddest dimension of what has happened to Ekman-Larsson is not the professional indignity of being benched after delivering at a high level. Players at this level of professional hockey understand that the business operates with a cold logic that does not always align with competitive merit. The saddest dimension is what his situation confirms about the franchise's relationship with its own stated ambitions. Toronto does not need another analysis of why its competitive window is closing. It needs an honest internal reckoning with whether the people making decisions inside this organization are actually equipped to make the choices that championship-level hockey demands. Choices that require resisting the pressure to appear busy, resisting the temptation to sacrifice long-term structural health for short-term headline management, and resisting the institutional cowardice of treating the franchise's most credible assets as problems to be traded away rather than foundations to be built upon. Toronto Maple Leafs front office accountability. Ekman-Larsson came to Toronto as a champion. He deserved to be treated as one, not just during the honeymoon period of a summer signing, but through the difficult competitive moments that reveal what an organization actually values when the pressure is real and the decisions are hard. Instead, he has been shown exactly what Toronto values when the pressure arrives: the appearance of movement over the reality of commitment, and the comfort of asset accumulation over the discomfort of genuine accountability. The blueprint for what this franchise should look like has been sitting in the Stanley Cup Parade photographs from Florida. Ekman-Larsson knows what it takes. The question that demands an honest answer from everyone inside that building is whether Toronto was ever genuinely prepared to do what it takes, or whether the promise made to a champion this summer was always just another beautifully constructed illusion in a franchise that has become expert at building them. Sound off below, because this is a kind of organizational moment that defines franchises for years in either direction, and the Maple Leafs faithful deserve a real conversation about which direction this is actually heading.